Welcome, everybody, back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege. Today is Wednesday, September 18th, here to recap some more storylines around the NFL regarding Week 2, but also looking forward to Week 3. The first segment we're going to cover on today's show has to do with the Cowboys defense. A lot to talk about them, their performance not only from the Saints game, but also dating back to 2023. We're going to go into what we think is wrong with the Dallas Cowboys defense, obviously. Then, in the next couple of segments later on, we're going to preview some of the games in Week 3, specifically the Ravens and the Cowboys game, and also the Eagles and the Saints game, as I believe those are two of the most pivotal games already early on in this season, and a lot more segments coming up later on, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But before we get started on anything, I'd like to remind you guys, if you've got any questions during the show, we want to hear about it. Your input is a big part of what makes this show great, and we thrive on your energy and insights. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat box. And now, if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to go about that. Just use the new super chat feature we have available to you guys. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit the super chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support, and we're always so thankful to have you guys as part of our community. Make sure to hit that super chat button to be part of the show. But now we can dive into this Dallas Cowboys defense situation a lot more, because Dallas, quite frankly, got stomped on by the New Orleans Saints this past Sunday. 44-19 was the final score, and they basically let Alvin Kamara run freely all over them. The running game obviously was an issue, and then off of that, the pass game became a problem. And just from the start, you saw that the Saints offense, just in general, from start to pretty much the end of the third quarter, a little bit into that fourth quarter, they just couldn't do any wrong, it seemed like, right? Every play, every decision that they made was golden. They scored on their first 6 possessions, I believe, in that game. They were all touchdowns as well. So, it's remarkable that actually happened, that they executed at that level. It probably won't continue at that level, right, going forward, but it's an impressive win so early on. One, because the Saints weren't considered a major player really at all heading into this year. I think with the issues with Alvin Kamara's contract, the offensive performance off of last year, them not really adding too much to their entire team overall, that was one side of the story. And then the Cowboys also bringing back the same defense, basically the same personnel, but obviously changing the defensive coordinator, and still obviously being the Cowboys, still a contender in the NFC. So this was a big statement win for the New Orleans Saints, I think, to prove more so that they are for real this year potentially. But to focus on what I want to bring up right in this segment, the Cowboys defense, right? A lot has been said about Dallas's defense, their run defense specifically, and how schematically it doesn't work against the West Coast offense, right? Against the outside zone and then everything that comes along with that, right? The defense doesn't seem to fit. Anytime they play a team running this offense, they seem to just capitulate, and the score lines get very ugly. And the reasons behind that, there were some comments that Micah Parsons made, Mike McCarthy made, and Mike Zimmer made as well that I want to bring up that I thought added to the context of this entire thing. Who better to comment on it than Micah Parsons, right? One of the players on said defense. He started off the streak of statements by saying, "I believe we just got outplayed. Whoever played on that field, everyone didn't play to 100%. And that's just me being accountable and saying the truth." Pretty much what he said there, but also you can kind of get the sense that he's referring to maybe an effort sort of standpoint where not everyone is giving 100% effort, or just not everyone, I don't want to say cares, but it's just not fully invested in doing everything possible for this defense at this time. That's how Mike is feeling, apparently. And then off of that comment, it got to Mike McCarthy, and he sort of responded to it. And he said, I wouldn't say it's an effort issue. They finished better than we did. I thought they played better than we did at the end of each play. Pretty simple statement from there, pretty generic, but clearly saying and believing that he doesn't think it's an effort sort of thing, right? It's just the fact that they executed better to an extent. And then Mike Zimmer, not really agreeing with Mike McCarthy, but more so just taking it upon himself by saying, really, most of the guys I didn't coach up good enough. It really isn't one spot. There were things that we didn't do well. We ran under some blocks. We had some perimeter run force issues. That's on me. So him taking the high road, if you will, just blaming the performance and everything pretty much on him, resting on his shoulders. And over the last two home games for the Dallas Cowboys, and this is where, I'll give my thoughts on it. Over their last two games against, obviously, the Saints now and before, going back to their last playoff game against the Green Bay Packers, this Dallas defense has given up 92 points, 233 rushing yards combined to Alvin Kamara and Aaron Jones in those two games. And in the Packers game, they put up a bit more of a fight, scoring more points. And this time, the offense, scored even less points. Again, pretty much with the same crowd, with the same group of guys outside of Tony Pollard and a couple offensive linemen. That's also where I wanted to go with this overall, because to me, talking about, what's wrong with this Dallas Cowboys defense, why are they, putting up performances like this, right? We saw it last year. We hope that it would have been rectified by this year. Hopefully, Mike Zimmer, we thought coming in, the reputation that he has as a defensive coordinator and the performance we saw in Cleveland, we were anticipating to not see anything anywhere close to what we saw against Green Bay last year. But to me, I feel like it's just a personnel issue on not just the defense, right? Not who they just have on defense, but on the overall roster of this team. I think the makeup of this team is just inadequate, to be quite frankly with you. And I don't necessarily think it's on Mike Zimmer. I know he takes the blame for it, and he takes the responsibility for not getting the guys prepared. But ultimately, I think that at some point, the players are the ones out there, right? They are the protagonists in a lot, if on everything that happens out there. And to me, I think the overall makeup of this team just doesn't fit and isn't right. And I think we saw it last year. And then the fact that they didn't add or change anything about it, just, I don't know how I was supposed to think anything different of this team or expect anything different of them if they brought back the same team and they thought that the same issues weren't going to pop up. Because again, I just feel like they don't have the pieces necessary to respond in some of these games where they come out and they get punched in the mouth per se, right? They're not built to play from behind. And what I mean by that is the fact that this was the issue last year, right? Obviously, but still the Cowboys remained adamant that they had the pieces in-house, that they were going to keep and develop some of their young guys and really put a lot of trust in the players that they already had, regardless of the fact that they lost some offensive linemen, they lost some defensive linemen as well. And I feel like those losses piled up onto the fact that they didn't add anybody else outside of Eric Kendricks. And I'm sure I'm missing one or two other players, but it wasn't enough, basically, is what I'm trying to say. No significant changes in free agency to bring in any sort of outside help. Of course, it was all affected by the contract situations, right? They had to choose to pay either CD and Dak or, just try and bring in some outside help and potentially not re-sign one of these guys. So adamantly, I do know that they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place there with trying to bring in some new people, but also ultimately getting worse, right, by not having Lamb or Dak get extended and potentially leave your team the next season. So I know that decision is probably impossible to make. You're more than often than not going to side with CeeDee Lamb and Dak, and that's what the Cowboys did to extend them. But I feel like with this makeup of this team, most good teams are complementary of each side of the ball, right? They're balanced, that word is thrown out all over the place. They're a balanced offense, they're a balanced defense, they're a balanced team overall because the offense complements the defense and vice versa. But with the Dallas Cowboys, I feel like this offense is so dependent, or the defense is so dependent on the offense to build up some sort of lead, hopefully bigger leads for this defense to kind of pin their ears back, know that the opposing team is going to pass, and that way Micah, DeMarcus Lawrence, and these guys can get involved in the game. That way they can create these big splash plays. But the other way around also is that I feel that this offense is likewise so dependent on the defense for turnovers, because offensively they're so reliant on CeeDee Lamb, and they need something else to kind of spark them when they go stagnant. And I just don't feel like one or the other is really providing what that other side of the ball needs, right? Because the offense is so reliant on CeeDee Lamb, like I mentioned, they can't generate anything, especially if they're one-dimensional with the run game that they provide with Zeke or Rico Dowdle and any of these guys. It's not good enough really to sustain a consistent threat from the running game, and when that's not working, it leads to a lot of 3-and-outs, and then from that point on, the defense is back out there on the field. They're on the field too much. They can't stop anybody, especially if they're getting gashed in the running game. Now, the defense is all discombobulated, and they can't do what they do best, right? Trying to rush the passer like we saw in Cleveland, right? And negating everything that the opposing offense wants to do with these great pass rushers. So when either side of the ball is not helping each other out, then you get results like this where nothing seems to be working, because I just feel like the pieces that they have in-house aren't necessarily fitting and executing to the level they want to believe they can get to. But I just feel like we've seen it enough times already now that it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that results like this happen when they face good running teams. And it's significant because it seems like we've already seen this movie before, right? We've already seen the Cowboys beat bad teams, be in close games sometimes when they're creating turnovers. That's another thing that they're not really doing so far through 2 weeks. So when none of that is really working out, what kind of team are they? And more often than not, we see results like this that are surprising, I think, just because they're the Cowboys and you don't think or want to believe that they're playing this poor. But if you go back to last year, same team, same head coach, pretty much same idea with this overall team. It's just the same movie we see each and every year, it seems. And until something changes, I know, again, the decision was extremely tough. They probably made the right decision, but now living with the situation that they've gotten themselves into, deciding between Dak and CeeDee or bringing in new players, they decided right probably, but they're the same team again. So unless I don't even know where to even point to try and create a difference in this team, in this defense. Yeah, Mike Zimmer came in. Maybe he can get something else out of them. But until I see it, I can't convince myself enough to think that they're just going to find something and pull something out of nowhere where they're going to look different on defense and especially on offense, because a lot of the pieces that they lost were significant. And right now it seems like they're trying to grasp for anything that could lead to any more positive results. It's hard to get worse than last Sunday, but going forward, we'll see how they try and build off of this, right? Because it is hard to play worse than they did against the Saints. But that leads me perfectly into my next segment where we're going to preview that next game against the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens will travel to Dallas to take on the Cowboys in Week 3. We're going to preview it, going to bring you guys all the factors, the key matchups to watch out for, some of the consequences that could happen from whichever team loses this game. All of that is coming up right after the break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
We are back now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to bring you guys the first preview of Week 3 in one of the biggest matchups that I think we have in this week. We just finished talking about the Cowboys and their defense. How do they respond when the Ravens come into Dallas in a few days now, less than a week obviously, and take on the Dallas Cowboys in a second consecutive home game for the Dallas Cowboys as well? Kickoff is at 4:25 p.m. The Ravens come into this matchup 0-2, and the Dallas Cowboys enter it now at 1-1. Obviously off of the back of that loss to the New Orleans Saints and also winning the first game against the Cleveland Browns. Both of them that I just mentioned now, the Cowboys coming off a pretty bad loss, and also the Ravens not coming off of the best performance either, at least towards the end of the game against the Raiders. They gave up another big lead that, we were hoping to see become rectified with the addition of Derrick Henry, but obviously they're not there yet in regards to him and how they want to use him. More on that in a little bit. But, both of them coming off of pretty bad losses. They still have a bad taste in their mouth, and I think there's a good opportunity to kind of set the record straight for both of these teams, right? The Ravens, if they get a win on the road at Dallas, traveling across the country to the Cowboys Stadium, right? Beating one of the NFC contenders. And likewise for the Cowboys, beating the team that made it to the AFC Championship game in the Ravens. Still very good, still have an MVP as their quarterback. A lot riding on this, I think, in my opinion. But before we get to the what-ifs of what could happen if when one of these teams loses, obviously, we'll talk about the Cowboys here first. Looking at the Cowboys in this situation, no real new injuries to kind of report on, but the one that has been carrying over from Week 1 is that injury to their tight end, Jake Ferguson. According to Stephen Jones, Jake Ferguson was very close to playing last week. He almost made the attempt to play against the Saints, but they decided to not go with that decision to try and preserve him a little bit more. And he should be good to go for this week. If he was really close last week and he goes through another week of practice, maybe with more participation this week, I'm expecting to see Jake Ferguson out there. It'll be a lot of help for this Cowboys offense that really, again, overly relies on CeeDee Lamb. So that's one thing. That's really the only injury news for the Dallas Cowboys. They're obviously, Ferguson coming back should help their offense tremendously, especially when you got guys like Roquan Smith, Kyle Hamilton. You're going to need someone to create a bit of a threat for them when they're out there on the field. And again, a big emphasis on the Cowboys this week is how they respond on defense. How does that defense respond to allowing 44 points against the New Orleans Saints, and also their offense trying to get off to a quicker start, because I think they were just bomb rushed against the New Orleans Saints. The Saints scoring touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. The Cowboys offense was really just kind of taken aback by it, right? It just surprised by it, off put a lot of times in that game where, of course, I think it's unrealistic to expect them to respond with 5 or 6 straight touchdowns like the Saints did. But even still, I felt like they were a bit sluggish, just a bit like a step behind a lot of the time. So by the time the Saints, we get into the second quarter and the Saints are up like 21-6 or something like that. I forget how it went. From that point on, if your offense isn't clicking, you almost have no chance to catch up to the Saints. So that's where we saw some of the biggest issues with this Cowboys team last week and how they try to rectify that. Now looking at the Ravens and any injuries, there's no real injuries to kind of report on them. They're still looking for their first win, however, right? They are 0-2 now after another fourth quarter debacle against the Las Vegas Raiders. They have not figured out yet how to use the bell cow of a running back that they have in Derrick Henry. The dynamic between running it with him, when to use Justice Hill, when to run it with Lamar Jackson, and how to incorporate the pass catchers all into that equation, I think is still lacking. And I do understand it is a bit a bit rushed to kind of expect them to know how to use every single player at this point in the season and how early it is. But I think we would have liked to have seen more of an understanding that, Derek already on your team is probably the second best player already. So to not use him, even if you are still trying to figure out how to incorporate him in the totality of the offense, you just still need to have him out there and use him to run the ball, to affect defense, kind of manipulate them, and keep them on their toes, right? Because once he's not on the field, most teams, like the Raiders did, pretty much predict that you're not going to run the ball, and then that way you become predictable. Even if you have Lamar and his running ability, you're limiting yourself as to what sort of things you can do, right? Because when you have Derek out there and you can still do all these different things like running with Lamar, pass it, or even hand it off to Derek, the defense has more to worry about, obviously, right, than when Justice Hill is out there. Maybe they don't worry about the run anymore and only have to focus on Lamar and the passing game as opposed to three different things, right? So that's something I want to see more of the Ravens and how they try to incorporate that into their game rather than just being so predictable of what they do when Justice Hill is out there and compared also to when Derrick Henry's out there. And they are trying to figure everything out right now. Their defense is also looking a bit shaky. I was already critical of their secondary a bit. I know Nate Wiggins didn't play in the contest against the Raiders, and that's something outside of Marlon Humphrey that I am worried about a little bit with them. But he should be back. I don't have a timetable on him, but I'm expecting him back relatively soon. But also the pass rush, always looking good. Ajabo's looking good as well, the pass rusher from Michigan. Justin Madubuike is still there, but I feel like they are still just missing an extra level of this defense, right? Last year with Clowney and Patrick Queen, obviously, Geno Stone, and the amount of turnovers he registered. All those guys I feel like are missing, maybe not to such a grave extent, but you do sort of notice their missing presence at some points with this defense. They don't seem as dominant, able to shut the door completely in these two games that I have seen out of them. And, the emphasis on just finishing the game for them, right? They don't want to start 0-3. The last time they did start 0-3 was in 2015, where they finished 5-11. And finishing these games off, especially against better teams like the Cowboys, right, is going to be huge. Not to discredit the Raiders, but that's a game they had to finish. Being up 10 points in the final 10 minutes or so, there is a lot of time left, but when you have a guy like Derrick Henry, you should be finishing off teams. When you're in that situation, that's what good teams do. And now, looking at some of the questions that I do have with this game overall, what I'll be looking for is, will the Ravens take advantage of the poor performance we've seen from this Dallas Cowboy defense over the past 2 weeks, and are they able to finally show that full potential or something close to that in this game? And something else also, will the Dallas Cowboys defense rebound, and will they continue to create problems, or will they start creating problems for the Baltimore Ravens? Are they going to continue to have problems with what to use Derrick Henry for, when to use him, being effective with him, still being all in the ebbs and flows of the offense? Those are two things that I'll be looking for in this game to see who responds and answers the call on Sunday. But that leads me into some of the key matchups and factors that I will also be looking at to ultimately decide this game, right? Because I think it's going to come down to a few different points here that will affect which team looks more effective, who looks more reliant or just reliable upon the fact that if they hit all these keys and they look better just from last week to this week, I think it'll be a big point in deciding this game. One of the key matchups I will be looking at, obviously alluding to the fact before, is the Dallas Cowboys defensive line against Derrick Henry and that Baltimore offensive line. Not just in the running game, obviously that's the biggest point, but pass rushers, how effective Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence, and all these guys are in not only rushing Lamar Jackson, but keeping him in the pocket and making sure that Lamar doesn't rush for over 100 yards in this game, right? That's something they have to address on top of keeping track of Derrick Henry. Also, another key matchup is Jake Ferguson and going up against Roquan Smith and that Baltimore secondary. I don't have another receiver that can kind of create problems for the Baltimore Ravens secondary. So how much of a factor Jake Ferguson will be and how effective he'll be going up against, Roquan Smith in coverage or Kyle Hamilton. And can he make an impact right away, right? Can he have like 5 catches for like 50-something yards or something like that at least to create some sort of threat outside of CeeDee Lamb? And the last matchup I'm looking at also now is Mike Zimmer, the defensive coordinator for the Cowboys, going up against Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator for the Ravens. These two guys, a lot of criticism you could say going to them. Todd Monken maybe not using all of his weapons appropriately, and Mike Zimmer trying to rebound after that performance from last week. How do they study each other? How do they address each other's weaknesses and try to create an advantage off of that, right? How much does Todd Monken run the ball knowing that the Cowboys struggled last week? Are we going to see a lot of outside zones? Are we going to see some more of that incorporated, more of Lamar? I have a comment here, Rico Diaz. Hey, my friend, I am coming from Chicago. That's where I live. That's where I live at. No, don't even think of it. If you do, I'm not a Bears fan. I'm not yet because I live in Chicago and doesn't mean I'm a Bears fan. I'm not. Are you a Baltimore Ravens fan or a Cowboys fan? I am not. I'm a Steelers fan. Funny enough, talking about the Ravens, I am a Steelers fan. I'd be lying to say if I wasn't a little bit happy with the problems I'm seeing from the Ravens, but it comes with being a fan, right? The certain level of dislike and respect you have for the Ravens. You look like Hispanic. Are you Hispanic? I'm Hispanic too, from Chicago. I am also Hispanic. My parents are from Peru, but I was born here. So yeah, I am Steelers fan. On top of that, big fan of them for a while now. So getting back into the football now, talking about them, and Mike Zimmer going up against Todd Monken is going to be a huge matchup overall. And some of the factors here to just round it off that I'll be looking for more development throughout the game. Which quarterback will help their team out more to a victory, right? Because I think ultimately in these games, it comes down to the quarterbacks, right? Lamar, how good of a performance he puts in, as well as Dak Prescott as well. The offense doesn't look good, and a lot of that has to fall on Dak's shoulders. Missing some throws. It just wasn't all the fact that they don't have the weapons. Sometimes Dak did miss a couple of those throws in that Saints game. So fixing all that up, which quarterback will be the difference, and also who steps up outside of CeeDee Lamb. Looking at Jake Ferguson, like I mentioned before, maybe Zeke, or just somebody to kind of take the pressure off of CeeDee Lamb. And lastly, can Baltimore hold on to a lead, or can the Dallas Cowboys overcome a deficit potentially? Can they maybe go down 10 points or something like that? And with that being the case, is that going to be the end of the game, or are the Ravens still going to have problems with holding on to leads, right? That could be something that I am looking forward to in these games. But now getting to my predictions, who I think will win. I think the Ravens finally get their first win because I trust their offense more than I trust the Dallas Cowboys offense, just for the simple fact that there's more X factors, more players on the Ravens offense that I think can go out and make a play outside of Derek, right? They're not just focusing on Derek. They're focusing on Lamar. They're focusing in on also Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman to an extent, Isaiah Likely, Mark Andrews as well. They have a bunch of different guys that can create some sort of offense by themselves. Whereas the Cowboys, I think you're still struggling with finding some sort of spark from the running game. Jalen Tolbert and some of these other guys, are they reliable enough to become bigger targets for Dak? I feel like I'm not there yet. So I'm liking the Ravens offense more from that standpoint. And also, I like Roquan Smith also on the Baltimore defense to shut down any sort of run game that the Dallas Cowboys can try to get going. And if that's the case, they become one-dimensional again, and I think it just makes it easier for this Ravens defense. I think just overall, the Dallas defense, I think, lacks the physicality that is going to be needed to stop Derrick Henry. And if I am not surprised with what I see on Sunday, I think it's going to be more of the same. If anything, it'll help the Ravens kind of get back on track here if they take it to the Cowboys. And, if the Cowboys lose this game, go to 1-2, it'll be like the sky is falling, I think, the next day on Monday, because 1-2, not playing well relatively in all these games, is going to be a problem, obviously, and there's going to have to be some sort of consequences to me when we get to Monday, though. We're not there yet, but those are my predictions. I feel like the Ravens go to Dallas, and win this game by a score of, I'll say, they'll win 23-14 in this game, I'll say. Not that high scoring, but the Ravens get the win regardless of the fact. But with that now behind us, moving on to some more topics I wanted to get into. Another game I wanted to cover was the Eagles and the New Orleans Saints. Another big game, I think, for two teams that are contenders now at this point. The Eagles carrying on from this offseason, but the Saints surprising everybody this year so far. And could they be potential contenders? I think this will be a great matchup to answer that question and how serious both of these teams can be this year. We're going to preview it just like we did in this segment with the Ravens and the Cowboys, so stick around. We'll be right back in just a few seconds.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
We are back now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to go from one preview into talking about another one that I think is just going to be as significant in this week's round of games between the Eagles and the New Orleans Saints. A statement game, like you guys see on your screen, between the both of them, right? Because it is a huge NFC matchup for the simple fact that the Eagles, uber talented, top to bottom on offense. They have some great players on defense as well. But you have the Eagles coming to town, coming into New Orleans against the Saints that have surprised a lot of people, right, in this early portion of the year. How they beat the Cowboys, how they handled the Panthers, obviously, and just how efficient they look on offense. I'm pretty sure they lead a bunch of categories on the offensive side of the ball. So that's one thing, right? The Saints offense, trying to come in here after a loss to the Atlanta Falcons, trying to rebound. Still probably no A.J. Brown, so that's going to be a huge loss. But the Eagles coming in at 1-1 against the Saints at 2-0. Big game for the head-to-head, for the records just overall. If the Eagles fall to 1-2, potentially like the Cowboys, it could say a lot already about those two teams. And the Saints also, if they go to 3-0, definitely something not a lot of people were expecting. So to get into both of these teams a little bit more, we look at the Eagles, and I mentioned no A.J. Brown again, probably. There were reports saying that he is probably going to miss a couple weeks with that hamstring injury, so this is another game now that it's not ideal, but I feel like they still have enough with Smitty, with Goddard, with obviously Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley. They are coming off of a tough loss, only by 1 point there, but I think that had to do more so with the Falcons for a majority of it than it did with the Eagles and their offense as well. Their run game still with Saquon Barkley looked good still. He almost recorded another 100 rushing yards. I don't think he scored in that game. I'm almost positive he didn't. Jalen Hurts, played, I think, a cleaner game than he did in Brazil against the Packers, where the criticism there were the turnovers, the interceptions. He did throw one late, but that doesn't really count because he's trying to mount a comeback and trying to make these throws. Those will appear on the stat sheet, but with the context of it, you kind of understand that he had to throw that just out of a panic sort of mode. So I don't pay too much attention to that. Overall, I thought he made better decisions on that offensive side of the ball, and having or not having A.J. Brown definitely hurt him just from that standpoint. So that's one thing. Certainly, this offense stuttered with that loss of A.J. Brown, but also I think the Falcons had good coverage as well on the back end. We'll see if the Saints are able to produce that same sort of production on the defensive side of the ball. And again, their defense for the Eagles held up in the red zone pretty much the entire night obviously up until the end when it mattered most. And that's a problem, going back to last year and how many leads they've given up and how many points they've let up in the final 2 minutes, which is obviously a problem. And it's not great that you're continuing to have that trend into this year now. But I feel like it's something they can clean up. Just from my personal opinion on it, I feel like that's something they can get better at as we go on through the year. And lastly here, on the defensive side of the ball, also having no pass rush and is an alarming sight to see from this Eagles defense, right? Because I've become used to seeing Fletcher Cox, Brandon Graham, Jalen Carter last year, Jordan Davis as well, get in there for a ton of sacks and just having one of the better defensive lines in all of football. Now to have none of your starters, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Josh Sweat, and Bryce Huff, who you brought over from the Jets, none of them have recorded a sack yet, and that's alarming to me. Again, still early on. They could obviously get hot here over the next couple of weeks, but from what I've seen, that isn't something that can continue to go on, especially against this Saints team, which now looking at them on the injury front, Marshawn Lattimore and Kalen Saunders were both questionable heading into this game. We'll see how much they practice during the week, obviously, heading into that game. But really, from the offensive standpoint, they've been as perfect as anybody, or probably the most perfect on that side of the ball out of anybody in the NFL. 91 points, touchdowns on their first 14 or 15 drives already is, again, just out of left field, something that you would have never dreamed of, I think, for this Saints team, just based on the offseason that they have, right? And I think, feelings around this organization, they weren't giving contender status around the offseason. So this has been a big surprise, at least to me. Alvin Kamara looks great. Derek Carr not being asked to do too much. It's all praise to their new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak. I think he's done an amazing job of playing to their strengths, using what he has at his disposal, and getting the absolute best out of it. I think is huge for this team now, and it's showing greatly in these two games that they have played. And we already knew that their defense was good enough, to be and get certain stops when they need to. So that part wasn't too surprising, right? I knew that they had guys like Demario Davis, Cam Jordan, Chase Young now, Marshawn Lattimore, Tyrann Mathieu. These are good players, so their defense I wasn't too surprised about, but the fact that their offense is just outperforming any expectation, I think, is really the biggest thing for them. And everything on offense here, the major point with this offense is that I feel like it looks like it's all actually like a game plan, right? And I know that sounds like really simple, but it all looks like from the start of the game and whatever plays that they call, it all builds up and it all progresses as the game goes on. And from that point, something that you ran at the beginning of the game played a factor in how you ran it in the third quarter, how you build off of it. Maybe the same set, same personnel out there, but you run a play action or you run an outside zone off of it. Everything looks like it goes step by step, gets progressively more advanced as the game goes on. The running game establishes everything, and then the passing game has success off of that. So that's what I've been pretty much very satisfied with, how everything looks very rhythmic. They go at their own pace, and that's why I feel like they've been so successful. And now this is a great test, right, to see, like I said before, where the Eagles are, if they're able to contend with what looks like the best offense in football, and the Saints also to play a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, right? They were major contenders last year. They made the Super Bowl not too long ago. They have one of the more talented offenses, at least in the entire NFL. Are they able to handle them like they did the Cowboys and go to 3-0? Some statement is going to be made off of this game, and That's why I'm looking forward to this game so much. And, the Saints praised for their execution, their game plans on offense. The Eagles praised for their talent. I think also all of that's going to come into play in this matchup. And speaking about matchups now, like we did in the last segment, the matchups I'm looking forward to the most in this game is going to be that secondary, Marshawn Lattimore, Tyrann Mathieu against Devontae Smith, and the Philadelphia Eagles receivers in this game, right? Because against the Atlanta Falcons, Jesse Bates evidently ended up making a play in that game, sealing the game with that interception, but I think Justin Simmons himself, A.J. Terrell did a well enough job to cover Devontae Smith. He still did his thing, but again, the loss of A.J. Brown really made a difference, so I'm looking forward to see who wins in that matchup if the Saints are able to shut down Devontae Smith and make it difficult for Jalen Hurts. Then also, we have two new coordinators going up against each other. New offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak against the new defensive coordinator Vic Fangio for the Philadelphia Eagles. You could argue that they're both kind of trending in different directions, with Vic Fangio maybe not convincing too much right now, but Clint Kubiak just acing everything he does. Whether that continues or Vic Fangio, changes something to create some more problems, that'll be fascinating to see develop. And just these two running backs, right? Already two of the best running backs so far in 2024. Who has more success? Who affects the game more in this mini matchup between Saquon and Alvin Kamara? Not directly facing off against each other, but a big part in how this game will go will be on how successful each of them are. And the factors into this game off of the matchups will be, again, which running back gets the advantage more and helps their team out a lot more. Both of them putting in great performances so far. They're definitely going to be needed in the passing game, the running game, everything for their offenses. Then another factor will be which pass rush could create more pressure to Hurts or Derek Carr, right? Can this Eagles defensive line finally get going and throw Derek Carr off of his perfect rhythm that he has been on for the first 2 weeks? And likewise, can Cam Jordan, Chase Young get to Jalen Hurts and maybe lead him to making some of these bad decisions on some of these throws, not reading defenses correctly, and just throwing interceptions that leaves everybody confused? That's also going to be a huge part in this game. And lastly, which quarterback will make more plays, right? Which quarterback will shuffle through the challenges of the opposing defense and make more plays with his legs, with some of the throws, everything like that. Obviously, Kirk won that matchup last week. He made the biggest play when it mattered most, executing that 2-minute drive to perfection. So off of the bat of that, can we see Jalen Hurts rebound and go into New Orleans and play tremendously better to get a win in a hostile environment, right? With the Saints being good, apparently, that stadium is going to be very, very hostile, and it's going to be a great scene to watch overall. And that leads me into my predictions, right, in this game. I feel like because the Eagles desperately need this game and the Saints haven't faced this level of offensive line yet. They've played the Panthers, they've played the Cowboys offensive line that isn't as good as the Eagles, and a running back as good as Saquon Barkley. I think that'll be huge for the Eagles in winning this game. Ultimately, I think they will rebound and win this game. I feel like the Eagles will control most of the time of possession in this game and kind of cool down that Saints offense to not have them on the field as much and just keep them rolling. I feel like Saquon, this offensive line, are able, if they're able to take over this game, I think that'll be the deciding factor overall. I like the Philadelphia defensive backs also. I like Quinyon Mitchell. I like Darius Slay and C.J. Gardner-Johnson going up against one of his former teams. I think this will be a good situation where maybe Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed aren't in situations where they can create space because the defensive backs are all over them. I think that also could throw this Saints offense off a little bit more. And this Philadelphia approach of bending but not breaking and allowing touchdowns, I think could also make the difference. They didn't allow a lot of touchdowns, right? They only allowed 2 in the Falcons game, and their offense just wasn't able to keep up at the end of the day with that drop by Saquon Barkley, but 9 times out of 10 he makes that catch. So I feel like they'll get everything together this game. It'll look a lot more like the Packers game I'm anticipating in Brazil. So I think the Eagles will pull it off and get an upset win. I don't even know if I would call it that. I haven't checked any of the lines or anything like that, but it feels like an upset if they're able to beat this red-hot Saints offense. But let me know what you guys think of my predictions and give your guys' predictions as well in the chat box. But now, moving away from the previews, we're going to look at 2 situations in the next 2 segments that I thought were interesting, looking at the injuries, similar injuries that the Chiefs and 49ers are dealing with both of their starting running backs being out and both of their starting wide receivers also being out. Which set of injuries worries me more going further into 2024? And then in the last segment, more on the defense. Which defense worries me more between the Jets, the Eagles, and the Dallas Cowboys? Both of those topics are coming up in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Jumping back now into the action and looking at 2 situations that I found very fascinating of how they've developed so far in this 2024 NFL season. Arguably the 2 best teams in the NFL, definitely from last year, right, making the Super Bowl, and arguably this year, right? Apart from the loss that the Vikings suffered, I think the 49ers and the Chiefs are definitely among the top of the NFL hierarchy in the best teams in the league. So with that being the case, they're both dealing with some concerning injuries to a lot of their stars already so early on in this year. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs injuries and what they're dealing with. You look at Hollywood Brown, the big offseason acquisition for the Chiefs. He had shoulder surgery because of an injury he suffered in a preseason game, and what looked like a situation where he could have came back in week 2, maybe even this week, turned very sour when they decided to get shoulder surgery. They decided that it was going to be better for him long term, and that way they placed him on the IR, but ultimately it got to a level where reports came out from ESPN and a bunch of different sources that Marquise Brown was likely to miss the entire regular season. He could be back for the playoffs, but still a massive blow for Hollywood Brown to not be incorporated in this team at all in the regular season. And then also just off the back of last week's game against the Bengals, Isaiah Pacheco, their starting running back, was diagnosed with a fractured right fibula. So he's set to miss now 6 to 8 weeks. That's a month and a half to 2 months now. He will be going on IR, and those are, you could say that Hollywood Brown, we don't know what he could have been, but projecting and staying true to those projections of how impactful Hollywood Brown could have been off of that fact, and, losing your starting running back now also, those are pretty big injuries now, especially with how Travis Kelce has looked also as well. These are pretty concerning for the Chiefs. And now also looking at the other team, the San Francisco 49ers, Christian McCaffrey, one of the biggest injury stories. He was dealing with a calf strain all throughout training camp. He didn't play in the preseason, obviously. He didn't play in week 1. Then as the days went on, Kyle Shanahan updated everyone and mentioned how this has developed into some sort of Achilles tendonitis, which was arguably more worrying because it isn't something that is always brought up as something that's very significant or severe. But he did mention, if you know Achilles tendonitis or know anything about it, it just makes the calf and the Achilles obviously a bit more susceptible to a tear potentially, right? Tearing that Achilles tendon, and that's the last thing we want to see with Christian McCaffrey, right? If that happens, his season's over. So with this developing a bit more into that Achilles tendonitis, they placed him on IR, and he'll miss the next 4 weeks after that decision. And also, again, after their last game in the loss to the Minnesota Vikings, Deebo Samuel also suffered a calf strain, and now he's set to miss a couple of weeks as well. And you look at both teams, one of their best wide receivers, their 2 starting running backs for both teams are now out injured. And where does that leave us now with these injuries, right? Which one should we be worried about more if I have any 49ers or Chiefs fans listening or something like that? Which ones do seem a bit more worrying at this point in the year? And I think we have to start with the fact that, the next 5 games for both of these teams look like this. The Chiefs in the next 5 games have the Atlanta Falcons on the road. They'll travel to Atlanta, and that game's going to be, pretty tricky, with the win that the Atlanta Falcons just got. Then they travel to the Los Angeles Chargers. They host the New Orleans Saints. Then they ironically play the 49ers after that. And lastly, in these next 5 games, they travel to Las Vegas in another matchup of that mini grudge match, mini rivalry that is brewing there. So not the easiest of schedules, right, based on who they have in their next 5 games. And on the other side, the 49ers in their next 5 games, they play at the Los Angeles Rams. They play at home against the Patriots and then the Arizona Cardinals. They travel to Seattle, and then in that final 5-game stretch there, they host the Kansas City Chiefs, right? The Chiefs have a bye week in week 6, whereas the 49ers have a bye week in week 9. That's why it lines up a bit funny, right, where the Chiefs play one more game extra. It's because they have a bye week in week 6. So that's why it kind of lines up like that. But regardless of that, I think obviously when we're talking about this question and creating an answer for it and how you base your answer off of that, I feel like both teams are very fortunate, right, to have 2 of the best play callers, 2 of the best coaches in the NFL, and also still some of the best players in the league, right? Brock and Patrick and George and Rashee Rice to an extent as well, looking very good. Brandon Ayuk for the 49ers they have a lot of talented players, so that's going to ease up some of the impact from the losses of McCaffrey and Pacheco and Hollywood Brown and Deebo, right? But still, the level of uncertainty you're able to kind of project is a little bit wavering, just because you look at the Chiefs and they did manage to go to 2-0 right after their win against the Kansas City Chiefs, whereas the 49ers fell to 1-1 after losing to the Minnesota Vikings. And the entire strength of schedule for both of these teams is about middle of the league. I think the 49ers have the 13th or 14th toughest schedule in the NFL, whereas the Chiefs have like the 16th or 17th hardest, right? So they're right there. That doesn't create that big of a difference. But I think when we look at the games and we look at the next 5 matchups, I'm a bit more worried about Kansas City just because of those opponents, right? I mentioned how the Falcons, coming off of that big win, they like to run the ball and have ran the ball very well. Their defense looks much improved just from last year, and I worry that the Chiefs aren't able to be as balanced and answer the time of possession or look as efficient without Isaiah Pacheco back there. I think he is very underrated. He's not talked about as much as obviously Patrick and Travis and now Rashee Rice. He brings so much to this offense that can create such a difference when opposing defenses, opposing players try to tackle him, right? The way that he runs, how aggressive he is. That all has to do with what he brings to the table. So not having him, I'm worried about that in that matchup against the Falcons, where their own running back is very, very good. So that worries me a little bit, right? And then you look at the Los Angeles Chargers, the next game on the Chiefs schedule. They look very stout in the running game. I think over the last 2 weeks, they ran it like 50-something times with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards combined. Despite the opponents, right, they're playing the Panthers and the Raiders, who might not be the toughest of opponents, but it's similar to Atlanta, right? This is a team that wants to run the ball, that wants to, create an ugly, low-scoring matchup, and I think the Chiefs maybe don't have the guys at their disposal to be able to keep up with how J.K. Dobbins is looking, with what Gus Edwards brings, and it makes it a bit more even when one team is so much better in the run game as opposed to the other team. And then it's also a divisional game, and those always seem to be a bit closer than anybody ever thinks. So that's another game. The Saints look extremely explosive on offense, and their defense is also pretty solid. So the fact that the Chiefs are playing in Arrowhead does soften the blow a little bit, but another team with another great running back coming in there and an arguably better defense and how they're playing with Clint Kubiak could be a sneaky game in there as well, with the losses of Hollywood Brown and now Isaiah Pacheco. And it's also, just very interesting when they play each other at, I think it's week, what is it? It's week 5. The next 5 games, this is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, week 7 or 6 when they play each other. We'll see who's back by then. Debo could be back, but if none of them are back, who, benefits off of the losses, right? Jordan Mason's looking good, but we don't really know what we're going to get out of Carson Steele or Samaje Perine or Kareem Hunt that is reportedly coming back to the Kansas City Chiefs, right? All of those things, I think, affect my thoughts on this discussion, right, between the 49ers and the Chiefs and which injuries I worry about more. Obviously, a lot of that is taken away when you have the best player in football in Patrick Mahomes, but I think last year we saw how human he could look in some of those games where the offense was really missing a dynamic weapon on offense, where it just looked stagnant and just not as talented as before. We saw a glimpse of that last year, and I worry that we could be heading there again this year in some of these games. And just overall, the 49ers should just have more favorable matchups, in my opinion. The Rams should have been a tough game, but their entire team is hurt. The Patriots, not necessarily one of the tougher teams anybody will say they will play. The Arizona Cardinals and the Seattle Seahawks, while it is a divisional game for both of those, I'm still holding out on the fact that they are a legit threat until they play better competition. The Seattle Seahawks, I should say, more so than the Cardinals, because the Cardinals put up a good fight against the Bills. So still the Seahawks, I still need to see more out of them. But I feel like San Francisco has more of an established group to kind of share the load, right, with Ayuk and Kittle, and only having to incorporate really Jordan Mason as a new guy into this offense, whereas the Chiefs have to do a lot more with a rookie in Xavier Worthy, another rookie in Carson Steele, and Kareem Hunt coming back after, not playing, not being in training camp or anything like that. Travis Kelce not looking like he usually does in the regular season, and Rashee Rice only still being in his second year. As good as he's looked, he's only a second-year player, so putting more responsibility on a lot more guys, younger guys, I think also gives me a bit more doubt about this Chiefs team and how they handle these injuries. So I'm definitely more worried about them. Does this threaten any sort of three-peat? Probably not. They're going to get their guys back, but could this affect the number 1 seed or something like that if the Bills keep playing like they do, or the Texans are as good as they are? Potentially. So they could lose out on that, but once the playoffs start, all bets are off. But at this point, I am a bit more worried about the Kansas City Chiefs from an injury standpoint compared to the 49ers. And lastly here, we have one more segment to get to, more on the defensive side of the ball. Which defense out of the Jets, the Eagles, and the Cowboys has worried me the most going forward, and which one could struggle to overcome these issues a lot more as we move on? That is coming up right after the break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Thank you for joining me here on this last segment of today's show. We started this entire episode talking about the Cowboys defense, and now we bring it all full circle here and incorporate two other defenses that I think are having some struggles here to start the 2024 NFL regular season. A consistent theme, I think, has built up over the last few weeks for these three contending teams, right? In the NFL, the Jets, the Eagles, and the Cowboys, all having doubts about certain parts about their defense so far. And, we are going to look at and just kind of compare all three of them, which has looked the worst and which could be the most troubling to try and get over their own hesitations, their own doubts going forward, and are they correctable as we move along in this regular season. So starting off with the New York Jets defense, this one was interesting just because they were meant to be the driving force, I think, of this New York Jets team, right? With Aaron Rodgers coming off of an injury, and even from the time that he was signed, being, 38, 39 years old or something like that, I don't think the plan was to have him come in and be MVP level Aaron Rodgers. I think with being 40 years old, I think it's not realistic to kind of expect him to play to that level, especially when, again, this defense played so good last year, and I think the narrative around this team, obviously last year, was the fact that, if they had a quarterback, if they had the offense rolling, this defense paired up with this offense could be so special, right? And now we're seeing it, but we are missing the pass rush element of this team that I think is become a bit more concerning, right, overall. They were overwhelmed in week 1 against the 49ers, losing 32-19. Their run defense didn't look that great or that good at all, allowing 147 yards on 28 carries to Jordan Mason. And Brock Purdy, like I mentioned on that pass rush, barely got his jersey dirty, barely had any sort of pressure in his face at all the entire night. And their offense just wasn't quite ready yet to be the catalyst for any sort of win, right? They weren't there quite ready to, be the reason why they won that game, right? They weren't ready to go toe-to-toe with an established 49ers offense, right? Aaron Rodgers in his first game back, still trying to feel out his teammates and what works out best for them. He looked good with Garrett, but Mike Williams really wasn't out there. Allen Lazard didn't impress. So they weren't at a spot where they could just take over a game, and with their defense kind of being overwhelmed, that raised some concerns in week 1. Then in week 2, their offense looked a little bit better after another week of trying to get used to each other. Really with Breece Hall, I should say, with this offense looked better because he was the second leading receiver and the lead rusher in this game, leading receiver behind Garrett Wilson. So not ideal, but it is looking better. You got Breece Hall involved more into this game, so that was a bit positive. But a negative of the result of this game was the fact that Jermaine Johnson tore his Achilles, unfortunately. So the depth now at pass rusher is really a concern, right? Where before you weren't already creating enough pass rush, and now you lose arguably your more established pass rusher in this defense. Now, Hassan Reddick is celebrating somewhere because now, if before I said that they had no other choice but to bring Hassan Reddick back to kind of take advantage of this moment, they really have nowhere else to look but to go to Hassan Reddick and provide him with a blank contract, a pen, and just tell him what he wants just to bring him in as a pass rusher, right? That's the kind of level that I feel like they need to have when trying to bring in someone, because if you don't have Jermaine Johnson, Will McDonald looked very good in this game. He recorded 3 sacks, so that's great, but are you going to depend solely on a second-year player to create all of your pass rush? The secondary is pretty solid, right? You have Quincy Williams, C.J. Mosley, Sauce Gardner, and guys like that on your defense, so you have to take advantage of that. Quinnen Williams on your defensive line also, I don't want to forget about him, but you need edge rushers as well to kind of shrink that pocket and have Quinnen Williams be more available to getting some of the sacks, creating some of his own pressure as well. So the biggest issue with them has been their pass rush and will continue to be their pass rush unless they get Hassan Reddick through that door as quick as possible. Then moving on to the Philadelphia Eagles defense, coming into this year, they were meant to improve drastically, I think, with Vic Fangio and some of the new players that they brought in. I am upset that they haven't played Devin White a bit more. I don't know what the story is with that, but if you don't want to start him, that's one thing. But I think Devin White could definitely add a lot if you just have him in, rotating in. But the fact that he hasn't played at all through the first 2 weeks, I know he was hurt in week 1, but he was inactive in week 2. So I'm not really liking how that's all playing out. But apart from that, I think a lot of people haven't been so impressed with them, and similarly with their pass rush, like I mentioned before in this episode. But in week 1, they allowed 29 points, but they still won with the level that they have on offense. So that's a great thing, right? Credit for holding the Packers, for holding strong in the red zone and only allowing field goals, right? But when you are faced in those situations where your offense might not be humming, or you're missing a piece or two, and the defense has to be almost perfect with no pass rush, then you have situations like you do in the Falcons game, right, where your defense is tired towards the end of the game. If you thought you had no pass rush before, when everyone's tired, it's basically like rushing with nobody out there, right? And that's what it looked like with Kirk Cousins out there on that 2-minute drive. It looked way too easy. I'm not going to say like I could have gone out there and completed those passes, but like Kirk dropped back like 4 steps, stopped, thought about whatever else regarding football or non-regarding football, and was still able to make the pass without having any Eagles defender in his face. That can't happen, especially with how good this defensive line should be. And now that's one thing. And going back to their starters, right, you look at this starting defensive line, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Josh Sweat, and Bryce Huff all don't have a sack yet. And only 2 weeks in, I do acknowledge that fact, but we got to see at least a little bit of something. I mean, you could have expected 1 sack out of these guys, but to have none, only Zach Bond has 2 on the year, and Milton Williams has 1. And that's pretty much it for this Eagles defense. It's not like they're getting it from anybody else. They're not producing enough sacks from everybody, and their starters are just not getting home as much as they should have, in my opinion. And also, their run defense hasn't looked necessarily unstoppable, with Bijan Robinson playing very well. Josh Jacobs played all right, but it just exposes the secondary, right? If you continue to have these running backs pile run after run after run, and then the defensive line obviously gets tired from run blocking, and they're not getting home anyway. The secondary looks exposed, like I said, right? Like I mentioned before with the Falcons, they won't hold all game, right? And that's when you have certain situations where Drake London just beats your corner, and with no pass rush, the quarterback sitting back there all day, someone's going to get open, and it makes you look even worse than you should. So that's pretty much my census overall with the Eagles and how their defense is a bit worrying from that standpoint. Again, with no pass rush like the New York Jets. And talking now about the Dallas Cowboys, I had to include them in here. And I mentioned all the problems with them before, right? The fact that they can't play from behind, the fact that this defensive line excels at getting after the quarterback, right, and trying to create turnovers and splash plays off of that. But when they're getting gashed against a solid running game, and the run blocking on the offensive lines, aren't necessarily great, or they're going up against run blocking offensive lines, they tend to struggle, and they become non-existent, right? The effect that this defense has almost becomes non-existent when they have to defend the run and they don't look ready to pass rush right after that. They aren't creating these sacks, especially with the turnovers that helped them so much last year with Deron Bland, with some of these guys creating strip sacks and whatnot. The benefit that they had off of that was that it sparked, or it put this offense in such favorable situations where they more often than not took advantage of that. Now, without these turnovers, now this defense having to do a lot more with the run, with the pass rush, it really doesn't work out because, again, I don't feel like they have the players to succeed with this game plan. And now the turnovers took off the pressure off of the offense last year when the defense scored for them or they put them in favorable situations, right, like I said. But now they're not really complementing each other. They're not creating those plays that they had a year ago. So that's the problem with them. I feel like they just don't have the players. And to answer, the question, which one has worried me the most right now, I feel like it has to be the Cowboys, because similarly to the question I posed before, which team do I feel will struggle to overcome these problems? I think it still is the Dallas Cowboys, right? Because it is one thing to say that your pass rush just isn't there, but it's also another thing to say that you just don't have the players to create that missing pass rush, right? The Eagles have players to create this pass rush, right? The Jets technically have somebody, but he hasn't been in the building, right, with Hassan Reddick. So once they figure that all out, I expect the Jets to get better. Robert Saleh is a defensive-minded coach. I expect him to fix this. Same with the Eagles, right? Jalen Carter is a tremendous player like we saw last year. Jordan Davis is a monster in the middle. Josh Sweat, he could create a little bit of his own. Bryce Huff had a 10-sack year last year. There is some adjustment period there. But the Dallas Cowboys, yes, they have Micah Parsons. Yes, they have DeMarcus Lawrence, Trayvon Diggs, Deron Bland once he comes back. But with that all being said, missing the players to create run-stopping, situations, guys in the middle, guys just willing to come downhill and stop the run, I feel like they're missing that kind of attitude, that kind of character about their defense, to which if they don't have it on the roster whatsoever, I don't know how they're going to get better moving forward unless their offense, finds something with Zeke and somebody else steps up at some point in the year. It's not going to look that much better overall as a team, and that's why the Cowboys defense right now, from the start of the show back until now, a full circle moment is Cowboys. So those are my feelings on it. Definitely concerns for these other teams, right? They're not just off the hook, but the Cowboys definitely, I think, have more on their plate to deal with in this 2024 season. But that is pretty much it for today's episode. Thank you guys for joining me on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network as well on all forms of social media. Check out more content around this show on both YouTube channels with a variety of different ways to cover the NFL over the course of this season. And lastly, remember to tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more of these live shows with me, Manny Maradiaga, covering all the headlines and stories around the NFL. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope to see you guys back here with me tomorrow.
Let's
go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.